to talk with me about a study on this very question of the future of sovereign debt, a study done by the Bank of International Settlements. I'm joined by Chris Leithner from the investment group Leithner and Associates. Chris Leithner, thanks for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Just before we go to the Bank of International Settlements, the report there by Sachin Das and Stephen Long, if there's a run on Greek banks, as there appears to be a trust issue now at the very least in the last couple of days, countries like Great Britain are in heavy debt already to Greece. Does this have knock-on effects to their debtor, to the countries that have lent them money?
The short answer is yes. And when we talk about a bank run, we're basically saying that depositors want their money back. The trouble, though, not just with Greek banks, but with any bank, full stop, any bank, including Australian banks, is that depositors' money does not sit in the vault, where people might think that it does. Why? Because banks lend deposits. So that when people want their money back, they can't have it back, quite literally. And it's been enshrined in law for the past 150 years. This is a legalized fraud. They're basically saying to depositors, this is a deposit. You can reclaim it instantly, anytime you like. But please don't do it too much or too often. Why? Because the money in actual fact is not there, and we can't repay you. So
because they're using it for other purposes.
That's exactly right. Yes. So that this.
But they do have to have a minimum cash holding, don't they, of 30% or something? I think it was.
In Australia, technically and legally, there is no minimum deposit requirement. In other countries, there is. And getting back, we'll get to the BIS report. Through a process called a BAL, as in the town in Switzerland, there are some recommended minimum requirements for banks, but they're not enshrined in legislation. Okay. But the critical point with any bank, and it's just not a Greek bank, is that when the horses take flight, that's to say depositors become nervous, it can happen. It happened to the biggest savings and loan in the United States not 18 months ago. It very nearly happened to Citigroup, so that when people take fright, then a seemingly impregnable fortress, a very strong bank, can be felled very, very quickly.
Well, to matters at hand, and the reason why I've asked you onto the program tonight is to explain and go through a little of this study done by the chief economist at the Bank of International Settlements. First of all, who or what is the Bank of International Settlements? You don't actually hear of it that often, but it's quite a pivotal finance institution.
The Bank of International Settlements was established as part of the Treaty of Versailles, which helped to settle the First World War. The purpose was basically to manage the gargantuan reparations to be paid by Germany and more generally by Eastern European countries. Its initial job was to manage those sorts of international transfers. That went bad in the 1920s. Since then, they've become, and I'm simplifying here, sort of an advisory body, not a central bank to central banks, but a sounding board to the world's central banks.
Indeed, most of the world's global capital goes through there at one point. It's like a central clearinghouse, isn't it?
Not quite, no. It plays much more an advisory role.
Oh, really?
So that the Bank of England, the Fed are completely sovereign. They're not going to answer to anybody, including the US Congress, by the way, or to the Parliament in London, so that the Bank of International Settlements plays important roles, but they're not officially sanctioned. They're not carved in stone. They're much more advisory, technical, behind-the-scenes sorts of things.
All right. Now, it's interesting to know, before we look at this study, that they were one of the few large institutions that warned of the coming global financial crisis, and they were largely, if not completely, ignored.
That's exactly right. William White was their chief economist at the time, a Canadian, who said to the Federal Reserve, under both Greenspan and Bernanke, to the Bank of England, to the world's central banks, he made 2 points. One is that there are big, big troubles out there. That's point one. Point two, the world's central banks, are causing those problems. And I'm drastically compressing or simplifying
yes.
that you are artificially depressing interest rates below a level which would occur in a free market. You are encouraging people to borrow far too much. By pushing those rates to a very artificially low level, you are inflating the prices of assets. So to give one example, people in Australia see the price of houses allegedly always rises. Credit is artificially cheaply available. The entire mentality of the country evolves over time such that, as our grandparents would have done, you don't save for 30 years and buy a house towards the end of your life. Rather, at the beginning of your life, you borrow, you get a mammoth mortgage, and then you repay it over the years. Why?
Until you're nearly dead.
That's exactly right. And the mentality in Australia today is much like it was in California or Arizona a few years ago. That's to say, the price of real estate never falls, so don't you worry, borrow as much as you possibly can. Why? Because inflation will take care of the debt.
Although Glenn Stevens, the Reserve Bank Governor of Australia, did warn about this attitude in the last week or so.
Oh, that's typical boilerplate. Why anyone would take that particularly seriously. If he was dead set serious about that, he would halt the growth of credit in its tracks. But he's not about to do that. Why? Because that would engender the very crash that's a logical implication of these sorts of policies. So yes, he did talk about that, but he's jawboning. He's certainly not going to do anything in a substantive sense in order to upset that apple cart.
If you've just tuned in, this is ABC Digital on the World Wide Web. My name's Steve Austin. I'm speaking with Chris Leithner from the investment group Leithner and Associates. Coming up to 8 o'clock news in about 12 minutes from now, 8 o'clock on the East Coast and 6 o'clock on the West Coast of Australia. Well, this study that's been publicly released by the Bank of International Settlements, it's called The Future of Public Debt. It's a study that's been prepared by the Bank of International Settlements chief economist, and it says in it things like the aftermath of the financial crisis is poised to bring a simmering fiscal problem in industrial economies to the boiling point. This is Germany, France, England, Ireland, all of the big OECD nations. What are they warning about?
This report and a couple of others is basically saying that Western welfare states are broke. Let me carefully say what I mean by that. Western governments, such as the United States, the UK, European governments, have made promises to people. They've promised to pay them pensions, hospital coverage and so on, pharmaceutical benefits, which they basically cannot afford to keep. That's to say, the money required to pay these benefits in the decades to come is so great. There was actually a Fed economist in Washington who did the sums. Lawrence Kotlikoff is his name. In about 2006, he says, in America, one of three things has to happen. Personal rates of income tax have to treble. And he said that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. Corporate rates of taxation have to double, but he says that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. Or alternatively, things like Social Security payments, Medicare benefits and whatnot have to have. But he says, oh, gee, that's politically impossible. That's not going to happen. So the end of this very long and technical report was that, gee, he shrugs his shoulder and says there's a severe problem here. Politically, the problem ultimately is democracy, that politicians have made promises, voters have believed those promises, and the gap between the financial reality in the next several decades and the promises made, you can't square that circle.
So governments or treasurers around the world or Chancellor of the Exchequers around the world are writing cheques that can't be cashed.
That's precisely right.
But they are being cashed, Chris Leithner. They are being cashed.
As we speak, and they're being cashed with funny money. The British government, to give one example, its budget has galloped forward by about 25%. Industrial production is lower now than it was close to 20 years ago. Private sector employment is lower.
Industrial production
is lower in the UK as we speak at this very moment, and lower than it was in 1991.
Is it more efficient? Is it a higher quality production?
The short answer is no. Private sector employment, as we speak today, is at a level as it was in Mrs. Thatcher's day in the mid-1980s. The point I'm getting at is that these so-called cheques are written with funny money. People are beginning to realize so much debt has been issued, so much debt has to continue to be issued. Who's going to buy all of this stuff? Well, individual people, corporations, finance houses, and so on. The short answer is the risks are becoming so great that at some stage, and the BIS report